from the resources and relationships that they need to flourish in any society. It weakens those relationships. And to use a restorative philosophy, that crime is a violation of people and of interpersonal relationships. Those violations create obligations. And the central obligation is to put right the wrongs. So the theme of this is, how do we put right the wrongs when children are in conflict, so that they can be reintegrated into the relationships and resources that they need to have a good life. What is reintegration? So if crime disconnects, reintegration connects, reconnects young people with the relationships, the resources they need, but also reconnects the criminal justice system and society with children. It's a two-way process. So reintegrative practices should activate not only the obligations of the child to respect the rights and needs of others and to desist from harming other people, but also the obligations of society and the criminal justice system towards the well-being, growth and development of its future citizens. So I hope within this model it's reflected that not only do young people have to learn to become responsible citizens, but we need to be responsible towards young people in supporting their growth and well-being. Ultimately, I think the framework is designed to enable young people in trouble to become more resourceful. And this is a model that I've used. It's an acronym for the word resource. And it's based on research into protective factors, the things in a young person's life that protect them from risk and help them to flourish and thrive in society. So these would include relationships based upon high expectations, which require them to learn the skills needed to take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. These are the external things: to improve their relationships, to have people in their lives that care about them and want them to have a good life and actively support them to do so, to help them learn the skills that they need to take their place in society and to take advantage of the opportunities that your society offers them. But I'm also interested in the inner life of children and helping them to understand what's going on in their lives and to take some personal responsibility for what they need to do, to make a commitment to do, and to make a real effort to stick to it. This is based on my understanding and my research into young people, that they also need to develop their own personal resilience and strength in order to do well in society, as well as have people who support them. So it's the inner and the outer lives of young people I'm interested in. The structure then reflects that model of understanding, responding, committing, and evaluating. So it starts with an understanding of how do young people come into conflict with the law, and then what should our response be? What should our general model be? And then what sort of practices and programs should we commit to delivering in a structured way that would activate reintegration? And finally, how do we evaluate the effort that we make so as that we're constantly improving it and making it more effective according to our experience? So to start off with trying to understand how young people come into conflict with the law, and I welcome your view of this, does this apply to society in Albania as well as other European societies? So what we have here is this, I suppose, what I call a cycle of the sort of factors that result in young people becoming heavily involved in crime and conflict with the law. There's, starting at the top, There's a lot of research that adverse childhood experiences, trauma in childhood, has an impact on later behavior. And I should say that this is not a deterministic model. At every stage, there are choices and options. And of course, this is what the practice should do, to increase the alternative routes rather than keep the young person on this cycle. So many children experience, unfortunately, trauma in their lives. They lose their grandmother, they have accidents and illnesses, or their parents have problems in their lives. Not everyone who suffers trauma in childhood becomes a criminal, because you can get over trauma if you have the supportive relationships in your life. It's those that lack adults in their lives that can help them to become secure and supported through a difficult position, that they then have a tendency to progress along this cycle. Sorry, I'm adjusting this because I can't see my own presentation here. So young people who have troubled backgrounds or not given support may adopt anti-criminal solutions to this situation. Not all of them do. Of course, many young people, unfortunately, become, mentally ill because of this. What we're talking about is those young people who use antisocial or criminal behavior as a way of coping. Then, of course, they're met with negative reactions and exclusion from society, from schools, from their communities. They develop a reputation for being a troublemaker. And again, this is not inevitable, because some schools are very good at understanding young people and holding them and understanding what they're going through and not excluding them. But of course, not all schools are like that. So some children will find them increasingly, because of their behavior, marginalized, pushed away. They need friends, they need people that they can be with. So they tend to gravitate towards those people in the same situation who've also been excluded. So they develop an association with antisocial peers, peer groups, gangs. This often leads to an escalation of offending because they're now in a group that have nothing else that they think they can do. And this brings them into contact with the criminal justice system. Of course, the criminal justice system can be a force for good and divert them from crime. But unfortunately, what we do know is that a lot of the practices within criminal justice can actually reinforce criminality, can make them feel less connected with society, more stigmatized, more labeled, and make it more difficult for them to access the resources that they need to have a better life. And this results in alienation. So the circle goes on. But the point I'm making is that at 8 stages, change can occur. It's not deterministic. Not every child ends up being a criminal because they've had a tough time in their childhood. So how do we respond to this? This is where I set out the problems that this framework is designed to address. So weak or negative relationships with their family, exclusion from basic resources that they need, education, training, employment, health, social and recreational activities. The stigma that is attached to young people due to their past behavior. The fact that they adopt as a defense an antisocial identity. They have this attitude that, well, if you don't like me, then I'm not going to care anymore. I'm just going to do what I want to do and not worry about your approval. And so they develop a sort of commitment to a more antisocial view of themselves. And also an adoption of a narrative that sort of engenders a lack of commitment to change. They begin to feel fatalistic. This is my life. I can't change. This is nothing that's going to change. Everybody hates me. So I'll just do what I've always. Now, in looking at those problems, we need to distinguish between 2 different types of young people who get in conflict with the law. There is what I call a sort of adolescent limited criminality, which is, it's just part of growing up. It's part of showing how brave you are, what you can do, that you challenge the boundaries and laws. It's a normal part of adolescence. And that does not need a very heavy response. But there is in every country that I'm aware of, and I suspect it's similar to in Albania, a much smaller group of young people who are persistent in their behavior, in their antisocial behavior. And they're much more difficult to engage with and to reintegrate, partly because of their own attitudes and partly because of the attitudes of society towards them. I guess this reintegration model is more aimed at addressing those very small but very difficult groups of young people who are engaged in crime and antisocial behavior. Oh, I should have said, sorry, if I can go back to do the first poll, or not the first poll, the second poll. This would be the time to do the second poll on whether the understanding of how people come into conflict is, do you find that's a useful way of looking at it, or it's useful but there's quite a lot missing in it, or it's not at all useful, and particularly in the context of the realities that you're facing in Albania. So do we just wait for a while for this to finish? Yeah. Could I say that those who are saying useful but some aspects missing, it would be useful to me and I think to others that you in the chat you could make comments on what you think is missing, what should be incorporated into this understanding that we've missed. And then we can look to see if we can improve the framework. Okay, so generally people are finding it useful, but as I say, there's some people who there's something missing, and I would be very interested to know what your views are, so we can include that in the finished document. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry for missing that. So let me just get back to where I was. Okay, so the key approaches, if you like, the theoretical and practice ideas that have informed this model in practice. As I said at the beginning, people felt when we consulted them that there were good resources within Albania and long-standing resources for mediation that are highly respected, but they're not used enough. They could be used a lot more in this area. And of course, this is an area of practice that is close to my heart. But also desistance research and theory is incorporated, trauma-informed practice, and motivational theory, because in my practice, I was a probation officer for 20 years in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And it was easy to see what a young person needed to reintegrate them, but it was a lot more difficult to motivate them to engage with it. So that's motivational theory. And I've also just added the 2018 Council of Europe recommendation concerning restorative justice in criminal matters, because I think the reintegration model that I'm going to outline is very consistent with that important document that was released to encourage member states of the Council of Europe to develop restorative justice and restorative practices generally in this area. This is just a diagram to say the restorative processes are more than victim-offender mediation or dialogue. They're as the way I look at it, there's three parties when a crime occurs and the harm ripples out. Obviously, there's the person responsible for the harm, the child who's in conflict with the law, the person who has been harmed and those close to them, and also the young person's family and friends, and there's society. Society has an interest both in the well-being of young people, but also in the fact that they do cause harm. So putting those three parties together and where they overlap, there are different restorative practices that can be used. Victim offender mediation, which is the most popular one in Europe, and I suspect in Albania, is between the person responsible for the harm and the people who are harmed by that person. But you can also involve society representatives in conferences and circles, and you can have what I call restorative conversations, just one-to-one. And you'll see that that comes into, there's a strong theme of coaching in a restorative way throughout the model when we get to the practices. Restorative processes can be used at different levels. The bottom level is a preventative level. Restorative parenting, parents can be helped to learn to parent and their children in a more restorative way. Family group conferences where families come together to work out their problems. And of course, mediation, restorative relationships in schools, restorative circles, and mediation in the community. All of these things can prevent young people escalating their behavior into crime when they're seen in conflict with people. Then there's mediation to divert entry into the criminal justice system. And I think this is useful because I think we can justify young people who have committed wrongful acts not being prosecuted through the courts if they have met the victim and put it right. And this keeps a lot of young people out of some of the damaging effects of entering into the criminal justice system. Once in the criminal justice system, of course, restorative processes can be used to ensure that they're made accountable, but also receive the support that they need in order to desist from offending. And finally, if that small group of young people end up in detention, these institutions can become much more restorative in their way of managing and relating to the young people and to help them to reintegrate into society. So it can be used at every stage of the process. Looking now at desistance theory, and what interests me is connecting the research that is coming out. Just in case anybody's not aware of the concept of desistance, this is research into why people stop offending. Most criminological research is into why people begin to offend and persist in it. So people now are looking at why do people stop offending? And it won't surprise you that the three main areas are they enter into relationships, which are more important to them than what they're getting from crime, and they don't want to lose those relationships. So the notion of social bonds, and of course that is very much a reintegrative idea. Maturation is eventually people develop the maturity and grow out of criminal activity. So how do we help young people mature and accept responsibility, bearing in mind that they are young people and it takes a while and they're not adults, but how do we nurture their growth? And finally, this inner world of narrative or identity, whereas what we notice with some young people who are in a lot of trouble is they begin to accept the identity of I am a criminal. And I don't need your approval. This is what I do. And they accept that this is going to be their life. And how does that change? That's sometimes the most difficult thing to change, that sort of inner consciousness that how do you change them to say you're a person of value in our society, you have something to contribute, we want to support you, we don't want to reject you, push you away. So these are the areas that I think the framework addresses and just to connect these areas of social bonds, maturation, narrative and identity to the things that I think restorative practices can do. Obviously, social bonds, we are trying to aim through restorative practices to strengthen or repair or develop new relationships. In maturation, to restore responsibility for the actions that young people take and their consequences on others, and also to restore respect for young people, starting with themselves, so that they learn to value and respect themselves, but also to gain the respect of others and in turn respect other people's rights. Trauma, to be aware, a lot of young people's offending may represent a way of coping with trauma and surviving in what they increasingly see as a threatening world, a scary world. And this can, again, have an impact on their motivation to offend. They lose a sense of who they are as human beings, as valuable human beings. That it can result in them wanting to harm themselves and also other people because of their behavior and their attitude and their distress. They can exclude themselves from the relationships and resources that they need. And also they begin to distrust the world. So there's a great resistance to the offer of help from those with goodwill and who wish to support their reintegration. So trauma can be a significant aspect of working with young people in conflict with the law. So the framework is based on trauma-informed practice. I think it requires very special people to be practitioners with these young people. Obviously, they need to be trained, but I think more importantly, it's who they are. Are they flexible, creative, and are they resilient? Are they willing to stick with young people? Because young people will test them out, reject them, etc. So they have to be pretty tough, but also very compassionate and strong. D.W. Winnicott, a child psychologist from England many years ago, said that antisocial or aggressive behavior in a child or a young person is often nothing more than an SOS for strong, loving, and confident adults. And so I think this is based on this idea that young people need adults in their lives who are loving, they're competent and confident, but also they can be strong as well, because it's a tough job. So the key principles of trauma-informed practice include to promote and sustain a sense of physical and psychological safety, of course, to build trustworthiness by being very transparent, to collaborate. You can't do it on your own. You need partnerships. You need to develop relationships with the children and their families, to respect and empower people's ability to make their own choices, and to respect cultural diversity and people's history, and particularly to respect gender issues in this area. So there's quite a lot that is demanded of the practitioner in this area. Moving on to the final area of sort of theory, motivation. So in English, we have this expression, are you ready, willing, and able to change? And it really reflects that. So readiness is understanding of where, when you're beginning to work with a young person, where are they at? We cannot assume that they're ready to change. There may be other things in their lives that need to be sorted out. And this model, the cycle of change, I have found very useful. I'll not go into detail about it. Many of you will be familiar with it. But it's understanding, does the young person see that there's a problem in their lives? Are they prepared to take the action? If they are, if they are taking action to change, are they getting the support to maintain that change? And also to recognize that relapse, is part of the change process and shouldn't be seen as a failure and as a rejection of the young person. Then willingness to change. I find the base viewing approach effective. The importance of expressing empathy, helping young people see the difference between what they want in life and how they're behaving. Avoiding getting into arguments. This is what I used to do all the time when I was a probation officer. Get into these battles of wills with young people, you know, trying to prove who's right and who's wrong. And of course, nobody wins those battles. So to roll with resistance is often the thing, that to work with the resistance rather than challenge it, face it head on, and to support their self-efficacy, to reinforce that it is possible to do things which you're already doing. And self-efficacy then brings me to the next one, ability to change. So what can develop the self-efficacy of a young person? And Bandura identifies these. And the model tries to reflect and build in the opportunities for this. They can experience actual achievement and recognition by others. So this is part of it, that it's not enough that they do good things. They need to be recognized by important people in their lives, that they are doing something positive. They need to see people modeling efficacy. This could be done through mentoring or through other people. And they need to get respect. They need, if somebody's trying to help them change, it needs to come from people that they respect rather than an authoritative figure who's just commanding them. And also just to be aware, again, of the psychological factors that arise, you know, if they are recovering from trauma, the level of anxiety they may feel about any change, and to be sensitive to that. Again, these are very sensitive areas. Okay, I think this is this the second? Yeah, I think this is the second poll, if that can be put up. So really I'm asking you, do those theories make sense to you? Okay, yeah, it's encouraging that a lot of people find them useful. Again, I'm so interested to hear, I hope through the chat facility, for those who feel that there are aspects missing. I'm convinced there are, and I would be very interested to strengthen the model if we could identify some of the other areas that we've neglected. So thank you very much for that. So I'll move on now into the actual framework. Following from the theory, the practices are organized on these levels. So action, designed to help the young person practice responsibility. So it's an action thing. It's to try and activate the young person to do something about the problems in their lives. engagement with others to generate supportive relationships and the resources that they need. So that's the external thing. And then the internal, to help them reflect on evidence. And the model is really about helping young people understand that if they take action, they may get good results. So that's one piece of evidence. But not only that, that the better the relationships they have within society, the more support they'll receive, the more recognition. This sense of getting recognition and celebration so that they can begin to change their identity and feel that they are valuable people, valuable citizens in our country, and change their narrative and realize that through action, through support of others, through recognition, that they can have a very different life to what they felt resigned to. This is what I call the institutional framework. In other words, what the professionals and the agencies need to do in order to support the practice. So if I take you through it step by step, as soon as a young person is identified as being in conflict with the law, then I'm suggesting what I'm calling a reintegration management group. That's the key agencies and professionals meet together to discuss the case. And then they decide, can this young person be diverted from prosecution, from the courts, into maybe a restorative process? Or is it the case so serious that they must go to court? They need to then allocate the responsibility for the case, that some agency takes on responsibility for the supervision of the case and management of it. And then the immediate needs and risks that the young person presents need to be addressed urgently. The young person needs to have what I call a key worker, one professional who will stick with him or her throughout, develop a relationship, offer coaching, offer support, connect that young person with the resources they need. To have one person, and hopefully, I mean, in my country, our problem is that person changes, the organization's constantly moving people around, and the young person is having to meet a new worker all the time. This is not ideal. It's maybe inevitable, but as far as we can, to have one key worker throughout the process. And then to implement the reintegration plan. It should be regularly reviewed by the reintegration management group. And then at the end, this is something that we often neglect in practice. We put a lot of thought and resources into the early stages of intervention, the assessment and planning. But then at the end, we very rarely signify, the achievements. And as I say, part of this model is very much recognizing the young person's efforts to change their behavior and improve their life. And so I'd recommend some sort of celebration, some sort of ritual where people get together, the people that are in that young person's lives, to congratulate that young person and say, you are a valuable human being, an important part of our society, and we want to support you to have a good life. So that's the institutional. Now, there will be a working protocol, and this is the stage we're at the moment on this project, developing a working protocol to see if the agencies can agree to some sort of a framework. Similar, it may not be exactly the same as that, but whatever is feasible and practical, and sign up and be committed to it. And for me, it is so important that if we're asking young people to commit to actions that will improve their lives and reduce the harm that they're causing, that the adults must make commitments to work together and to deliver what they said they would deliver. So often we let young people down, and that just actually pushes them backwards rather than forwards in their lives. So this is a very important stage, but it will be addressed more within the working protocol than the actual reintegration framework. The practice framework, I'm just going to outline it. It starts with a series of questions, and this is the initial stage of the practice is how do we include the young person in a process of change and reintegration? The first question is, how do we stabilize the situation? The young person's life might be in a certain amount of chaos and disorder because of their immediate needs. They may be homeless. They may have health needs. They may not be going to school. How do we stabilize that? And also any risks to child protection or serious harm to self and others. And from that, they should be referred to appropriate services which will address their needs, and a child protection or risk management plan needs to be developed very quickly. The other questions are more about engaging with the young person. And these are just questions that will structure conversations at the early stage with the young person. How do you think we should work together? What's going on in your life at the moment? What really matters to you in your life? What if this happened? Would that be better? And what are you willing to commit to working with me? So one of the ideas behind that is that quite often adults approach children in trouble with the question, what is the matter with you? What's wrong with you? What do we have to correct? What I find, I think really through my experience of restorative justice, is that a more motivational and more respectful question is, what's going on in your life and what really matters to you? What do you want in your life that you're not getting and you're having to take recourse to crying? So it's treating the young person as somebody who should be respected, is not just a product of their environment, is a thinking, creative, intelligent being that should be respected. And that they will be more motivated by pursuing what really matters to them than what we think they should be doing. And out of those questions, I'm hoping the other questions, so what's going to work? If we're agreed that these are the sort of things we can do together, let's see what will work with that. And it's a question rather than a statement, because I think it's an exploration with the young person. What is going to work better in your life? And not assuming that the adult knows already, but that it's a joint project of what is going to work better in your life. And it's also trying to get across to the young person that this only works if you actively participate in it. We cannot do it to you or for you. We can only do it with you, this reintegration business. This is based on my hard experience where, I've got young people, I decide this young person needs to get a job. I get him into a job, but I don't think, is it a job that he wants? Is it a job that will actually give him what he wants? And so within a week or two, he's lost the job. So it's much more important to really understand the young person, what their motivation is and what they think is important in their lives. Then it's into them participating actively in improving their relationships through maybe repairing or strengthening some relations. And of course, some relationships they may decide I should not be in a relationship with that person because they're not being good for me. How do they get the resources they need for a good life? Education, training, employment, recreation, and also health. Are they healthy, physically, emotionally, mentally, and address things under a health heading of things like substance misuse, alcohol and drugs. And then, of course, looking at their offending, the harm that they're causing other people. And the framework outlines in detail these processes, restorative processes, one-to-one dialogues, mediation, conferences, circles, mentoring, and circles of support and accountability. And there's a range of coaching conversations that are also outlined in the framework, helping the young person set goals, using the GROW model, using the respect model, non-violent communication, and helping them to take responsibility for what they said they would do. And the 4 C's are different conversations you can have when young people fail and make mistakes, which they will do, which we all do, and how you engage with helping them to learn from their mistakes. So these, the last, maybe, no, after this, we'll take the third poll. So finally, there is the notion of transformation and evaluation. How do we know that things have changed? And it's important to have a measure of that, and the framework includes some suggestions on how we could measure these outcomes. So I would like to think that at the end of a reintegration process, the young person has a greater number of responsible adults that they trust and who care about them in their lives than they did at the beginning. They have greater access to resources such as education or employment or training that we know are necessary for a better life. They have developed a healthier lifestyle, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, or in terms of substance abuse. Probably the most difficult one to measure is that they have a different sense of who they are. They see themselves as a valuable person, a person worthy of respect, and they have a view, a narrative, a story about themselves, about the future, that they can have a better life. They do not have to settle for a criminal lifestyle. And ultimately, they feel that they are a more resourceful person who wishes no longer to harm themselves or other people. So that's basically it. And I think at this stage we could do our third poll, which is relating to the usefulness of the framework of practice. Okay, well, that's interesting. majority of people believe that this will only work if substantial changes are implemented. And that may be a very good place to start in terms of our questions and answers and discussion. I'd welcome people's views on what needs to change if such a practice framework could be implemented in Albania. So thank you very much for that. And I just want to thank you for your attention. And I hope that now we have a little bit of time for people to raise issues that they think are important and ask any questions of me. But probably, more importantly, what are the issues that need to be addressed to improve the reintegration of young people who are in conflict with the law in Albania? So thank you very much. I'll take down my...
Thank you, Tim. I hope this has been interesting and useful for everybody attending this webinar. We are more than happy and you are more than welcome to write a question or your opinion in the chat box down the screen, or just give us a signal if you want to take the floor and say something. Okay, we have something from Ornella Lina. Outcome 2 and 3, it's difficult to be measured due to the fact that they are difficult to reach without institutional approach.
Okay, thank you. Is that Ornella?
Ornella, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of these things are very difficult to measure, and particularly I'm interested in qualitative measures rather than quantitative. I'm interested in the quality of a young person's life. I do suggest some of the things in the framework, and if you get a chance to have a look at the framework, there are some mechanisms to do that. But I agree that they are difficult to measure. I accept the point you're making, but I'm interested in what you mean that they're difficult to be reached without institutional approach. Would you mind just commenting, Ornella, about what you mean by the institutional approach?
Ornella, do you want me to give access or do you want to write the question?
Albana, I'm just going to write due to the fact that I have problems with audio here. Okay, I have other persons in the room, so it's difficult to talk.
Please use the chat box.
Okay.
It's time for us. If anybody else has anything to discuss, it will be useful and welcome as well.
Well, I want to have a short comment if it's possible, or?
Yes, Rasim, welcome.
Okay. The first, I'd like to thank you, Tim, for excellent presentation and others of issues, special restorative justice and restorative practicing, but also the other issues. I consider this webinar, this conversation, as another step in a European movement for restorative justice, strategy for change. Mm-hmm. And as the team know, and also the others, we have an expert team in Albania, very close to the foundation, to contribute for these initiatives. And I think the most important is also to address the challenge related to reintegration of children in conflict with the law and the possibility of using a restorative practicing or restorative justice as a first measure of diversion and also for the help the children they need. Very short, I want just to mention a good example of cooperation for development restorative justice with two public institutions in Albania, Specialist Probation Service and the prison system, the pre-detention for minors. Have been a long process of cooperation to introduce the restorative approach, to awareness, all of the stakeholders, also social workers, the staff, experts and specialists, and special to use in the case, to use the victim offender mediation, also a restorative dialogue, a restorative conversation, as a team mentioned. And through this kind of example, we bring some challenge also related to the presentation. And the first challenge, you know, there are some improvement in Albanian, especially after approved of the penal code for the children. And there are much more attention from the public institution, and of course also from the other civil society or association or international organization. But I want to mention the point of obligation of society for reintegration of the children. Before 2018, the system in Albania had been much more punitive for different reasons, and it's not time to explain why. And now it's much more, there are much more tendencies of reintegration, rehabilitation, resocialization, and restoration. But still there are also the other tendencies. So it means it is a process. And in respect of this, I want to mention a special good strategy in the paper from the government, but not the same level in practicing, and special to support with the fund. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit a lack of it. It is create a lot of problems and challenge. And another is the strategy in Albanian for post-care. So it means after a lot of work done in institution for reintegration, rehabilitation of children, what happened after release or after the prison? There are some rare activity or project from civil society, but not a national strategy or any intervention, concrete practicing to help the children and juveniles related to these issues. Still in the long list, I mentioned some of them, and maybe the others they can contribute.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it does relate to Ornella's point. The gap between the strategy, which is great, and the law, and the actual institutional support and the resources in the field to actually implement the strategy. May I be welcome views of others. I mean, this is a common problem in every country. It's not just Albania. The gap between, you know, what policymakers would like to happen and what actually happens, and the support that is required. I wonder what people think and what needs to be done to try and close that gap.
Sorry, I had my microphone muted. Thank you, Rasim, for your comments, and of course are valuable ones, especially knowing the local setup when we all are working. And of course, there is a need for improvement, especially on financial terms, but even on changing the mentalities of all stakeholders related to the one thing that you mentioned, the obligation of the society for the reintegration. I think this is something that takes time and takes changing of attitudes and mentalities. But if we may go on, Ornella Lina elaborated a little bit more her questions related to the outcomes.
Yeah.
The way how we measure the outcomes and how difficult it is. Just give me very few minutes to go back because there are different reactions in the chat box. So Ornella is saying, as per the framework, the social and health inclusion in Albania for this category of children is difficult, as we lack institutional support. And it continues again, as per the approach presented, I agree with the approach followed. Okay, this is a comment more than a question, I think, as they deal with the causes and give practical steps to be followed.
What I'm interested in this institutional support, because this is where my knowledge is not complete at all. I don't know enough about Albania. But what would need to be there in terms of institutional support, say on the social health inclusion area? What is necessary to fill that gap? What would you like to see happen?
We have different reactions as I see in the chat box. Like from Albiona, we have another thing. Albiona writes that I think that the circle of readiness to change, the motivation that we give to the children in conflict with the law can be one of the keys to prevent children to be in the same situation, and the role and support of social services to intervene is very crucial. And I think that we all agree with this. And Paula Zefi is writing that the distance term is really interesting, but how would we know for sure that it is a distance? And do we measure it? How we can be sure that this person won't turn back to the same patterns of criminal behavior?
Yeah.
Okay, and this is quite interesting and tricky question.
Yeah. Yeah. Just addressing that one, I mean, certainly I think the desistance researchers would say that it's a process, and the relapse is part of the process of desistance. We don't just suddenly change and never do anything wrong again, but we reduce our involvement in crime, and then eventually we stop. So I think that's a realistic point of view. We can never be sure that somebody is fully desisted from crime. But we can notice changes in their way of thinking, their view of themselves, their attitudes, the way they speak, that give us signs that they're on the road to desistance. Statistically, we know that, you know, the vast majority of people who've been involved in crime eventually stop. If you look at the people in your prisons, there are some very old people, but there are very few. There are many more young people in prison than old people. So something happens when they decide to stop committing crime. But I think what Paula is saying is very true, that desistance is very difficult to measure. the research that I've read goes on the basis of what's known as self-reports. You talk to the person who was involved in crime and has, and you ask them, you know, when was the last time you did something that was against the law? And you trust their honesty. And then you ask them, so what has led you to decide you're no longer going to commit crimes? But it's not an off-on button. It's a gradual process of change. And there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Always, it's never a smooth journey.
Thank you, Tim. Do we have any more questions or reactions? Okay, we have another reaction to the chat box. Bledina is writing, a proper approach requires continuous efforts, not only to prevent children from coming into conflict with the law in the first place, but also services for offering community-based and family-focused assistance to the children. And it can this can achieve rehabilitation and avoid repetition or recidivism. And media can be a powerful agent for promotion for promoting appropriate approaches. And yes, personally, I believe that media has a specific role. But
I think Lena is completely correct about the approach to prevent children from coming into conflict with the law. It's an interesting point to say about the media. I don't know what the media is like in Albania, but the media in Britain and Ireland tend to take a more punitive approach to youth crime. They tend to stigmatize young people and encourage harsher punishments. So I think it's useful as part of reintegration to try and engage with the media, to change it, to give them good news stories. The public like to read about the sensation of crime, but they also like stories of redemption as well, of how a young person has come through a difficult time and is now being a positive force in society rather than a negative. So I do think it would be useful to think about how to work with the media.
okay, then. Okay. There is one more comment from Suela Andoya. She writes that the session was seems useful, but she is concerned about understanding how children come in conflict with the law. So it was very interesting, this part, but the children are included in this model, the children with development disabilities who are orphan in social care and in social care services too?
Yeah, this is another very good question. Certainly in my country, up to 25% of young people who come into conflict with the law are under the care of social services and often accommodated in children's homes, orphanage. And we were surprised at how many young people with learning disabilities who have also got involved in crime. And this is quite a challenge because a lot of the methods that I'm recommending are about communicating, like having conversations, having restorative meetings. And what we found in my country, in Ireland, that a lot of the young people had difficulties with articulating their stories, what they felt. etc. So we had to adapt a lot of the processes to people who have developmental disabilities. I think it's if you like, it's our responsibility, our obligation to adapt our methods to the young people rather than to exclude them because they have a disability, or because they're they are orphans. We need to be doing the adapting to them rather than demanding that they fit into our more convenient structures. But those are very good questions that Swell is raising. Ornella's commenting about school-based programs, and yes, I would agree.
Okay, I missed it. Sorry. Thank you, Tim.
I would say in terms of prevention, schools have a very important role to play, and of course, there's a lot of experience of restorative practices within schools that reduce the amount of exclusions, expulsions, keep the difficult kids within the school and help them to, develop more responsibility for their behavior without rejecting them. So I think there's a lot that can be done within schools, school programs, etc. Very, very important indeed.
Okay, thank you, Tim. If we do not have any further comments or questions, I would like to kindly ask Bona to launch the final poll. Please vote to let us know how you considered this webinar, if it was according to your expectations. And while you are voting in this pool, I would like to thank each of you for attending this webinar. It has been very nice for us to see such a high number of people attending the webinar, and the mixed audience that we had this time. We had representatives from Ministry of Justice, Probation Office, Social Services, and Child Protection workers in different cities of Albania, and international and local NGOs that are working with juvenile justice issues. I really thank you very much for attending and interacting with us. I hope we'll be able to continue this set of webinars. We will notify everybody because we're trying to organize some online discussions with different issues related to practical issues related to case management of children in conflict with the law. So thank you for attending. I wish you will have a good day. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, Tim. See you tomorrow, Tim.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Bona, for the support.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you, Albania.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
See you. Bye.